It's, of course, very timely for us to have this evening's talk with the anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence on July the 4th. In an ideal world, we would have had our talk on that night, but obviously wouldn't fit in with the calendar. It gives me particular pleasure tonight to introduce our speaker, Frank Cogliano. He's a friend and former colleague who I've known for well over 30 years. Frank's Professor of American History at the University of Edinburgh, and between 1992 and 1997, he was a colleague in Southampton. So he's, if you like, he sacrificed life by the rivers Mystic and Charles for life by the rivers Itchen and Test. Because Frank is a son of Boston, lifelong Red Sox fan. I suspect his ashes will be scattered at Fenway Park. And yet he's made the United Kingdom, and in particular Scotland, his home, as I say, for the last 30 years. 2 years ago, he was academic director at Monticello, the estate of Thomas Jefferson, and this summer and autumn, he'll be the resident scholar at Washington's estate, Mount Vernon. He's someone who appears frequently on radio and television. He's a sort of permanent presence on BBC Radio Scotland as their American pundit. But if you're a regular listener to In Our Time, then on more than one occasion you will have heard Frank speak on various topics of American history. If you saw the recent Lucy Worsley Investigates the American Revolution, two-part series on BBC Two, you'll have seen Frank in the stacks at the National Archives talking about stamp duty with Lucy Worsley, and in fact Frank was the historical consultant for that, for those two programs. And that reflects the fact that on both sides of the Atlantic, Frank is an eminent colonial historian, widely respected. And that profile, that media profile, extends to his podcast, The Whiskey Rebellion, and also to his Instagram postings under the label of Cup of History, which I can heartily recommend to you. Very, very funny. But as I say, Frank's reputation rests primarily on his accomplishments as a scholar. He's authored, co-authored, or edited something like 14 books, and they include two publications which have just appeared in the last 4 weeks, 6 months or so, 6 weeks or so. One of them co-written with the historian Peter S. Unoff, Thomas Jefferson Survives, American Independence in His Time, and the other volume, a collection of essays, The American Revolution at 250. 24 historians reflect on the founding. And I can tell you as a historian that it's a stellar cast that, that appears in that book, that contributed to the book. And it's clearly a reflection of of Frank's high standing, both here and in the United States, that such eminent historians were only too willing to contribute to that volume. So it gives me particular pleasure, as I say, to introduce tonight Professor Frank Cogliano.
Thank you, Adrian. That's very kind. And thank you all for coming out. Well, Adrian's told you where I'm from, so you're prepared for that. There's always a frisson of disappointment. They hear I'm from the University of Edinburgh, and then they hear I'm not Scottish, and everyone's a little disappointed. Especially Our Lady from Scotland here. It's great to be here. It's a great privilege to be here. I should begin, well, I have a lot to say tonight, and I want to speak about the special relationship, but not necessarily in the way you expect. Now, I want to stipulate something at the outset, which is very, very important. I am one of you. So everything I say, I'm saying with love. I'm also one of them. And what I want to do tonight is I want to talk about the relationship between Britain and the United States over the past quarter millennium, but I also want to reflect on my own time here. As Adrian said, I came to Britain in 1992. I'm here because of you. You hired me. Came for a year with my wife. We were newly married then, and fully expected to stay for a year and return to the United States. I've been here ever since. So both countries mean a huge amount to me and are incredibly important to me. And the history of their relationship has always fascinated me as somebody from the United States who has lived here now more than half of my life. But Adrian's right. I mean, if you're from Boston, you're always from Boston. So here we are. Two heads of state. In fact, I should give you the background on this passport of mine. I didn't become British. I shouldn't give away all my data. This is being recorded. Until relatively recently, I lived here, for almost 30 years, I think, before I undertook UK nationality. Not a comment on the UK. But my wife used to say to me, my wife is neither American nor British. She'd say, you just got to get your British passport. Don't be so stupid. And I said, with what must be now seen in retrospect as hubris, listen, it's a retrograde step for a citizen of a republic to become a subject of a monarch. Now, I want to be clear. Remember, I love you. It's not a comment on the monarchy. My view on that has always been, this is your country, that's your government. If that's what you want, that's what you should have. So it's not a comment on the monarchy. But I felt quite strongly as, I done a little bit of family history on my father's side. My great-grandfather abjured his loyalty to Victor Emmanuel II, the King of Italy, in 1918 when he became a U.S. citizen, and I've seen that document. And I think Republican government is an important, small R Republican government was an important legacy of the American Revolution. So I fought my wife for this for years. And then she said, I'm really tired of having to wait for you in passport control and get the luggage when you sort of come swanning through thinking you're morally superior to me. And anyway, and then Donald Trump was elected president. And I thought, maybe a king isn't so bad. And maybe I want to make sure I can stay in the UK. I mean, I had indefinite leave to remain, but maybe I just better be sure about that. And maybe I shouldn't be quite so smug about it's a retrograde step to be, for a citizen of a republic to become a subject of a monarch. So now I'm one of you. But I am a historian of the American Revolution. And the American Revolution is a topic that obviously means a lot to me, but that has informed a lot of my thinking. I am going to, so I'm not going to hit you with a lot of text, but I want to begin with this, which is from Thomas Jefferson's draft of the Declaration of Independence. And it's Jefferson's draft. So Thomas Jefferson was the main author of the American Declaration of Independence, which was adopted on the 4th of July, 1776. Congress voted on independence on the 2nd of July and spent 2 days editing Thomas Jefferson's draft and cutting about 25% of it. We can talk about that if you want. But in Jefferson's original draft, and I'm really going to, so I've been worrying for the past half hour thinking, okay, do I turn around and read this? But I'm going to try and read it off that screen. We'll see if I can manage it. I'm sure the ministers who are here can see better than I can, because that's a pretty small screen. Anyway, Jefferson wrote in his draft of the Declaration of Independence, the Declaration of Independence has a structure. The first two paragraphs are the famous bits about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And then the middle section that people used to ignore is really long, and it's got the grievances against the king. It's got 27 charges against George III. That's where it says he has done this, he has done that, etc. And then it finishes up with a kind of flourish at the end. And this is from Jefferson's final paragraph. And Jefferson wrote in June of 1776, so exactly 250 years ago, about Britain, or the British, I should say. Nor have we been wanting in attention to our British brethren. Us. We must endeavor to forget our former love for them and to hold them as we hold the rest of mankind, enemies in war, in peace friends. We might have been a free and great people together, but communication of grandeur and of freedom, it seems, is below their dignity. Be it so, since they will have it. The road to glory and happiness is open to us too. We will climb it in a separate state and acquiesce in the necessity which pronounces our everlasting adieu. This is a breakup letter from somebody who's being jilted. We're going to be great without you. We don't need you. Congress cut this. Congress kept the sentence about enemies in war, enemies in war, in peace, friends, but cut the rest of the hyperbole. And I think this is interesting. I want to begin with this because I think it's a reminder that Americans did not want to declare independence in 1776. They did so as a last resort. And again, we can talk about this later if you want to. But that severing of the tie and the emotion that Jefferson expresses, which I think is quite sincere, was quite profound. This was one thing that I have to get over to my students in Edinburgh is, look, the American Revolution is a British Civil War. You need to see it as a British Civil War. It's also a British Revolution. After 1649, 1689, 1776 needs to be seen as a major event in British history as well as American history. The name is a problem. Everybody thinks it's about America and then they move on. But that emotion that Jefferson expresses is quite important. And I think it also sums up kind of the hyperbole that sometimes characterizes what we've now called the special relationship. Now, I want to warn you. I want to tell you what I'm not going to do tonight. I'm not going to talk about every diplomatic row between Britain and the United States because we don't have enough time for that. And frankly, those are very interesting. They're very powerful. Adrian and I have been talking about Suez earlier today, and we're clearly, I think we're in diplomatic terms at a historic low when it comes to transatlantic relations. I don't think that's a terribly original thought on my part. But I want to look deeper, because I think the relationship is deeper than that, and I think that's reflected in Jefferson's quote. But I think there's always been an ambivalence about this relationship on both sides that's characterized often by the kind of love that Jefferson expressed, but also a little bit of contempt sometimes, going both ways, misunderstandings. The old saw about us being two peoples divided by a common language is absolutely true. And misunderstandings. Give you a couple of examples to start. So what I want to do is kind of review that. I want to talk more on a cultural level. And I'm going to give you my impressions. Many of you, I'm sure, have American links. I suspect you all have opinions. And your views may not coincide with mine, so these are personal reflections. But I want to give you a kind of overview of what I think is happening at the cultural level, particularly in the recent past. But I'll do a little bit of an overview now. During the 19th century, after American independence, there's a real post-colonial cringe in the United States that Americans don't know what to do when it comes to Britain. On one hand, they feel morally superior. I know, I'm glad you're all sitting down. Americans think they're morally superior. You can laugh, it's okay. And they feel more virtuous than the British. But they also feel, the British are richer than we are. Did we make a mistake? Was independence a mistake? And they're really worried about what the British think of them. Frances Trollope, Fanny Trollope, who's pictured there, the father of Anthony Trollope, visited the United States in the 1830s, and she wrote a great book, Domestic Manners of the Americans. She didn't think they had any. So she went out to America to go to a utopian commune. She was, as so many British people have been, attracted by the idealism of America and what America's ability to redeem the world. And she got there, and she went to places like Ohio and Kentucky and was incredibly disappointed by what she encountered. If you want to read a very amusing book, read Fanny Trollope's Domestic Manners of the Americans. It's not that long. It's very witty. It's excoriating. I'm not going to read this entire quote to you, but basically that first sentence tells you all you need to know. I do not like them. I do not like their principles. I do not like their manners. I do not like their opinions. That's the whole book. But she goes on at great length about what she doesn't like, including, if you could read it behind me, she's talking about how terrible American table manners are. They're all eating with one knife. They're eating off their knives. She hates their table manners. And they pick their teeth after they eat. She's appalled. And in the earlier version of this talk, I had lots of examples of this. She complains about their manners. She says correctly, and this is something Europeans, but Brits in particular, have been saying for 250 years, these people talk about liberty all the time and they're slave drivers. And she's right about that, and that offends her. If you look at the cartoon, however, that's an American image of Mrs. Trollope. If you look there, that's what she looked like. But this is how she's being portrayed in the United States. So the love wasn't lost in either direction. And there are lots of examples of this. Charles Dickens's American Notes are a good example. Should be said, there were many European, including British, admirers of America in the 19th century. Tocqueville, of course, wrote possibly one of the greatest books written about the United States by a visitor, Democracy in America, at approximately the same time. But there were a lot of critics. Equally, there were many American critics of Britain at the time. I cut this out because it was a long quote, but I had a quote for you from Mark Twain, who's one of my favorite authors, who loved to make fun of British pretensions. And Twain blamed Walter Scott for causing the American Civil War in Life on the Mississippi, because he said, well, all those Southerners became obsessed with this sham chivalry, and instead of modernizing and becoming progressive like Yankees, they became fools, and that's why they fought. So he said, Walter Scott is responsible for the American Civil War. And there are a number of American critics of Britain in the 19th century. There's also several tropes that emerge that we see throughout. Anthony Trollope, Francis's son, a staple of his is the wealthy American heiress who has to marry a down-on-his-heels aristocrat and bail them out. This is a staple of Victorian literature that never quite goes away, and film. So we have this ambivalence in the 19th century, and it goes into the 20th century. We see it in film and various portrayals. I'm going to say a little bit more about this in a minute. What is the special relationship? If you search for the origin of the term, it's disputed. One of the most famous expressions of it was made by Winston Churchill in March of 1946 in Fulton, Missouri, at Westminster College. It's the same speech in which he made the reference to the Iron Curtain. So this is the Iron Curtain speech. And in that Iron Curtain speech, Churchill also mentioned the special relationship between the United States and Britain. Interestingly, and this is perhaps more timely now, he also said Canada. He said the United States and Canada and Britain have a special relationship. And the special relationship has been a sort of theme of British-American relations, certainly since the war, for the past 80 years. And really, it goes back a little bit further than that. The thing I would suggest to you is it's been honored in the breach more often than not, because presidents and prime ministers, whenever they're visiting each other, invoke the special relationship and pay lip service to it. But frequently, the United States and Britain are at odds with each other. John Sopel, the great British, the BBC journalist a few years ago, wrote, "If only they didn't speak English," a book about his time in America. And his argument was, you guys may not believe we speak English, but that's a different discussion. His argument was, Fanny Trollope didn't think we spoke proper English. Sopel's argument was, one of the problems that we in Britain have is because people in the United States speak English, we think we understand them. And we think they're like us, but they're actually much different. And he wrote that book from the perspective of somebody who spent a lot of time there. And it's those differences that I think are instructive. So in diplomatic and strategic terms and in terms of mutual defense, since the war, the United States and Britain have more or less cooperated. But again, there have been moments of serious division. Suez, the Falklands War, and of course the current conflict, or if we're to believe President Trump, the now ended conflict in the Gulf. So there have been, and behind the scenes, there have been a number of quite significant breaches between the two countries. But for public consumption, leaders from both countries always pay lip service to it. There's a story that told about, President Obama was very popular here. So that way, if there was a high watermark in the recent history of the special relationship, it would probably be the Obama presidency. But Obama was reminded by one of his aides when visiting Gordon Brown, I think it was, to mention the special relationship. And he said, yeah, I forgot the special relationship, of course. But he kind of laughed it off, like, oh yeah, we have to say this, we have to make them feel good. So it's always been imbued with a little bit of ambivalence and tension, I think, going both ways. The images you see there, the one on the left is from the First World War, at the end of the Second World War, at the end of the First World War, and it's Uncle Sam and Britannia arm in arm together. Bit rich, considering the Americans didn't turn up till very late in the First World War. Then the cartoon in the middle is from 1953, and you might not be able to see the text, but it talks about a Declaration of Interdependence. Uncle Sam has a copy of the Declaration of Independence in his back pocket, but this is a Declaration of Interdependence, and we see Uncle Sam and John Bull clasping hands. And on the right is a cartoon from the Cold War, basically the same period, which shows, again, Uncle Sam and John Bull singing from the same hymn sheet, while Russia looks in from the window saying, I hate this song. So that's the image of this for public view. As I said, I'm not really going to go into the diplomatic history in my presentation. I'm happy to do so in the Q&A. But again, I think it's been characterized as much by tension as not. What I want to suggest to you, however, and my main argument tonight, and I'm saying this upon reflection of 34 years in the UK now, is that I think that what we saw in the middle of the century, when we were celebrating how close Britain and the United States were, was more of a divergence between the two countries and the two cultures that has become a convergence. So we're in the kind of I want to offer, well, you may not think it's an optimistic note, I actually think Britain and America in cultural terms are closer than ever. I'm going to make this argument to you tonight. At a moment when in diplomatic and political terms, they're further apart than certainly at any time in my lifetime and in my memory. And so indulge me while I attempt to make this argument to you. So in the middle of the century, there's a great fascination between the British and the Americans. But there's also an awareness that they're not the same. Each is seen as exotic in the other country. And the examples I've given you are two of the best. We've got Elvis Presley when he landed at Prestwick in 1960, and the Beatles when they were on the Ed Sullivan Show in 1964. Both of these were seen as kind of almost revolutionary moments when people in each of the countries were exposed to these incredibly famous people from the other country. Remember, there's no internet then. The kind of communication we take for granted wasn't possible. And so when the Beatles appeared on the Ed Sullivan Show in 1964, That's when the 1960s began in the United States, I would argue. Take another case. When Bob Dylan said, "Play it loud," we're in church, I can't give the full quote, in 1966, that's when the 60s began. You can't say it began in 1966, we're getting on. But these were alien cultural moments, I think, that underscored the differences between the two countries at the same time that there was a fascination with those differences, or the culture that produced those differences. And I think we've seen a convergence since. And I want to give you a couple of examples, both of which are probably known to you. There's the Waldorf salad episode of Fawlty Towers, which was originally in the script called USA. And you'll all know you may know the Waldorf salad guy. Not the most flattering portrayal of an American, but it was certainly pandering to certain cultural assumptions here in the UK about Americans. Cultural assumptions, I should say, that still persist to some extent. And the Waldorf salad guy is incredibly obnoxious. He's loud. He's overbearing. His English wife is embarrassed by him because of his boorish behavior in demanding a Waldorf salad. And Basil Fawlty doesn't know what a Waldorf salad is, and he's trying to work it out. It's a classic moment from 1979. Perhaps less well known to you, but I think really important as well, going the other way. And these two examples, I think, embody the differences between the countries as seen by people on both sides of the Atlantic. In Seinfeld in 1994, there's an episode called The Soup. It's not the Soup Nazi episode, it's a different episode. But in The Soup, Elaine, played by Julia Louis-Dreyfus, meets this English guy who comes to stay with her, Simon, who's pictured there. And Simon is well-dressed. Well, he's not that well-dressed because he takes a suit. He gets one of Jerry Seinfeld's suits, but he's well-dressed. He's quite posh in the way that Americans believe you all are posh. And he's a con man. He's a grifter. He takes money from her. He's basically pretending to be something he isn't, which is a trope in American popular culture in the 20th century, that the British think they're better than us. Think of Kevin Kline's character in A Fish Called Wanda. You think you're better than us, you're not better than us. And Simon, as a character in Seinfeld, is exactly that stereotype. So we have two stereotypes 15 years apart that are quite hostile and quite negative about the other culture, produced by, in the case of the Waldorf salad, produced by the BBC, and in the case of Seinfeld, by an American production company. These are actually quite negative stereotypes. And they're stereotypes that each have quite deep roots in those countries. I think so I often get asked, especially in the US, what do they think about us? I say, well, how much time do you have? And people often ask me, they're particularly concerned in this age of Trump. I get this question a lot when I go to the US. Do they really hate us? So, well, not all of us, but but what I say is, actually, having lived here since 1992, I've seen the kind of attitudes towards the US ebb and flow. I think they were quite positive in the 90s. I think the Gulf War, or the Iraq War, was a real turning point because Britain went into that war with the United States in the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks. And as many of you will remember, that was very unpopular here in the UK. And basically, Britain followed the United States as a dutiful ally, as upholding the principles of the special relationship, and followed the United States into that war. And I think, based on my own experience, and I was in Edinburgh then, there was probably more hostility to the United States in 2003 in the immediate aftermath of the Iraq War and the invasion of Iraq than there is today. There's real anger at the United States today in the UK. But what I encounter in my daily life, which is something, this shocks Americans when I tell them this. People aren't angry in the way they were 20 plus years ago. They feel pity. And this is something, looking at Mike as an American abroad, Americans abroad, we're used to being liked, being hated, whatever. Pitied, that's new. It's like, oh, I'm so sorry. And I encounter that emotion a lot, which is very interesting. Whereas, and the reason I'm showing Love Actually is I think this is the kind of high watermark of that anti-American cultural stereotype. That's seen in Love Actually when Hugh Grant confronts Billy Bob Thornton's president of the United States and sort of puts him in his place, that you all love every Christmas. That is, I think, the best cultural expression of that moment during the Iraq War. So I keep saying Gulf War, during the Iraq War, that really epitomized what I think was the divergence in the two cultures, the differences which were stressed and expressed in popular culture and based on those kind of slightly contemptuous stereotypes. Hugh Grant is good looking and he's smooth and he's articulate when he puts down Billy Bob Thornton. Billy Bob Thornton is playing a not very well disguised George W. Bush. The fact he's an American called Billy Bob just, reinforces this. And that moment, I think it's a quite important moment in both the history of film, but as an expression of the state of the special relationship at that point. And again, my view would be 30 plus years in this country, that was actually the low point in cultural terms and in terms of just living my life in the UK. Now, don't feel sorry for me. I haven't suffered in the UK at all. This is not a therapy session for me. But that would be my observation. But what I think we've seen not weirdly, I think there are lots of reasons for it, particularly social media, is I think we've seen a convergence in the two cultures. And I want to give you two examples to illustrate that from the recent past, the very recent past. So as some of you may know, Bruce Springsteen was on a tour of the United States, the Land of Hope and Glory tour, which was basically an anti-Trump tour, where he went to many major cities, and he gave the same speech every night. He loves those homilies during his concerts, and to criticize President Trump and to encourage Americans to resist the Trump administration. He did that for the first time last year in Manchester. And it was interesting, if you can stream it on whatever your favorite streaming service is, you can listen to it because you can hear the speech he gives condemning President Trump. But he did that in the UK. Again, 20 years before, the Dixie Chicks did that in the UK, and that was the end of their careers. Well, they've come back, but they were really, really seriously criticized for that in the United States. Bruce Springsteen has a certain kind of cultural clout that the Dixie Chicks didn't, so I think that partially explains it, and there's a gender dimension to that, but the differences are instructive, I think. But it's interesting that Springsteen introduced that theme in his work, or expressed it so forcefully here in the UK. And he did it for the rest of that tour in the UK, and then revived it this spring in the United States. A couple of weeks ago, Stephen Colbert, the American late-night comic and chat show host, had his last episode. He was forced off the air because the company that owns the network, Paramount, has been purchased by an ally of President Trump, and Colbert was quite critical of President Trump. And so because of that, he was forced off the air on May 21st. His very last guest was Paul McCartney. On the very stage in the Ed Sullivan Theater that the Beatles performed on in 1964. The fact that Paul McCartney was his last guest, and the belief was that Paul McCartney had cultural cachet in the United States, and of course he does. I mean, he's a global figure. But I think these two examples demonstrate there's been a kind of convergence in the past generation. As the UK and the United States have drifted apart politically and diplomatically, I hope they'll drift back together, but I think in cultural terms, we're closer than ever. And I give you Ted Lasso as an example. Now, many of you may not know the origin story for Ted Lasso. Ted Lasso began as a beer advert on American television when, I think it was NBC, I may be wrong about that, when an American network began showing the Premier League on Saturday mornings in the United States. So it's 7 or 8 years ago. And Jason Sudeikis, who plays Ted Lasso, played an over-the-top American football coach trying to explain soccer to Americans. And it was a comedy bit on a beer advert. And on one hand, it was playing on the cultural differences between Brits and Americans. Can I say one thing parenthetically, if I may interrupt myself? British people used to say soccer. When you mock Americans for saying soccer, as in many ways, we speak English as you used to. And you need to respect that. So we don't need any lectures about football. Anyway, here endeth the editorial. So Ted Lasso began as this caricature, a little bit in the spirit of the Waldorf salad. In the beer advert, he's an over-the-top caricature of Americans. The interesting thing is, he's an over-the-top caricature of Americans that was broadcast to Americans. You all think we don't have a sense of irony. I actually think our superpower is that we do and you don't realize it. But that's a different conversation. And so Ted Lasso began as a character in a beer advert. And then it became a show on Apple TV. And as somebody who's lived in both countries, what I think is the genius of Ted Lasso is it gets both of them. I mean, they're idealized. It's a drama, it's a comedy, it's entertainment. So let's not push this too far. It mocks both, but it gets them pretty accurately, and it does so in kind of a sensitive way. Because what tended to happen before was American productions stereotype British people like Simon and Seinfeld. British productions like Fawlty Towers in 1979 stereotyped Americans in a particular way. Ted Lasso is interesting to me because it satirizes both, but does so in quite a gentle way. It's not mean-spirited at all. That's a big part of the selling point. And he's naive and so on. So on one hand, he's a stereotype of an American in Britain, but on the other, what it gets is it gets both sides with some sensitivity, I think. And the writer's room in Ted Lasso and the production team is British and American. So the people writing those characters aren't just making it up about the other side. And I think Ted Lasso is evidence for this convergence. And I think that convergence is important. So I think what we've seen, because of social media, because of streaming, because of the globalized world we're living in, there's been a convergence. Now, I don't think this means the Americanization of British culture is imminent. We've been hearing about that since 1776. The threat that the Americans are going to ruin everything. I think it's different from that. I think, nothing bothers me more. Well, actually, lots of things. I was about to make a grandiose statement. A thing that annoys me a little is Americans who use Britishisms. When I hear, I deal with American academics all the time. And when they say, oh, let's take a meeting or take a decision on this, I say, no, you don't take decisions. You make decisions. Don't talk like that. They're cookies, not biscuits. So what I'm saying, it goes the other way. There's been a kind of British influence in the US has increased, I think, and certainly in the time I've lived here. Maybe it's me. So it's not a one-way street of Americanization as we used to fear. I actually think it goes both ways. But it's happening. I was discussing this with my wife before I came here earlier in the week, and she said, yes, but both America and Britain aren't as important as they used to be. And I think that's right in cultural terms. So I think we're seeing a convergence between Britain and America at a time when culture's globalized. We've got K-pop. You can watch whatever Scandi noir you want. Where we have access, it's not just an American or an Anglophone-dominated culture anymore, which I think is a good thing. But it's interesting that at least I've observed this convergence. I'm not going to end quite yet. Which brings me back to the king. King Charles went to America in April and had a state visit. I, as a historian of the United States who resisted becoming British because it's a retrograde step for a citizen of a republic to become a subject of a monarch, you might have heard me say that, thought, why are we having King Charles come for the celebration of our revolution? And as a British person, I said, why is he going there after Trump has been so insulting to us and our service people over the past 6 months? But King Charles showed us why when he spoke before Congress. And what he said was very powerful, and frankly, it was better than what Hugh Grant said to Billy Bob Thornton. He said, with the spirit of 1776 in our minds, we can perhaps agree that we do not always agree. Ours is a partnership born out of dispute, but no less strong for it. So perhaps in this example, we can discern that our nations are in fact instinctively like-minded, a product of the common democratic, legal, and social tradition in which our governance is rooted to this day. Now, given that he said that before Congress, which has done very little in response to President Trump's assaults on the rule of law, that was a mic drop moment, I think, as they say in the business. But he also stressed that commonality. There's history. Our relationship is born of dispute. That's a little, it is, but he had to give a nod to 1776 because it's our year. But it was a very, very powerful moment and testimony to why it was a good idea that I became British. Also a reminder, Americans can be a little bit smug about our Constitution. We love our Constitution. And we think our written Constitution is the way to go, and your, now mine, unwritten Constitution was a problem. Well, we've learned a little bit in recent years how much of the American Constitution, despite being written, actually rests on norms, just like the British Constitution, and those norms may not be quite as strong as we believed. And it took King Charles to remind Americans of that. I want to end with a quote. This is a quote written by a Scottish Presbyterian minister who had emigrated to New York named John Mason. And he wrote to his son, also called John Mason, who was heading to Edinburgh to study. By the way, and this is a fact I drop into our alumni briefings, in 1776, when the United States declared independence from Britain, 10% of the students at the University of Edinburgh were from America. So we have long-standing roots in America. Anyway, John Mason's son, John Mason Jr., is heading to America to study divinity. And his dad, Edinburgh-born, is giving him advice on how to behave in Scotland. You may find this advice wise. He's telling an American going to Scotland how to behave. Avoid loud laughter and smile gracefully. Be careful not to hurt the feelings of any person present. While in Britain, say little about your own country. Speak respectfully of the British government. Avoid controversy about the lake contest between Britain and the United States. That lake contest was the American Revolution. Plain people do not study cookery, and you will hurt them much by showing any contempt of the provision they may set before you. Don't make fun of the food. Be not noisy when you stop in a tavern. Be polite to the landlord and the servants. I have told all of my relatives when they come, it's not about politics. It's not our accents necessarily, although you don't love those the way we love yours. It's the volume at which we speak. If you cut that in half, your life will go much better. John Mason said the same thing to his son in 1791, and it's very, very good advice. Anyway, them's my thoughts. I'd love to hear your thoughts, and I'm happy to take questions. Thank you so much.
Right, as Frank says, happy to take questions. And right, we've got a gentleman down.
Thank you. You mentioned the Falklands as though the Americans weren't on our side. I was involved with the Falklands, and we were losing the battle, and the Americans actually came up with the Sidewinder missiles, a lot of them, and that turned the tide. So I just wondered why you thought there was a division. Politically, they couldn't be on the Argentinians.
Well, again, it's a good question, thank you. So I think in terms of its public diplomacy and the way the war was presented and received in the United States, there was very little sympathy for it. And so I think that the Reagan administration would have provided its assistance covertly. Yes, and so I think that was important. It turns out the Reagan administration liked to provide lots of weapons covertly, but that's a different story. But that was a time, I think, when it came to public opinion, at least, that there was a division of opinion. And I think Trump revived that weirdly. I mean, some of Trump's responses, when he gratuitously brought up the Falklands recently in one of his recent attacks on the UK. So it was interesting. So, yeah. There was a question in the back as well, Adrian.
Okay. Yeah. I'm afraid I have a double question. Firstly, with your experience of universities, can you comment on what I perceive as the destruction of the culture of Cambridge and yielding to the hard left, and to a lesser extent in Oxford? The second half of my question is, we talk about the United States. Are we serious in that expression? When I look at the decisions coming out of the circuit district courts and the pontifications of the Supreme Court, many states have decided to ignore the Supreme Court, like the state of Maine. They have refused to adopt gun laws. Now, gun laws does not refer to men with rifles out hunting. It refers to the tradition of, are you carrying a gun in your pocket? And that seems to be the situation in most of what I can see. The state of California, for instance, Idaho.
That's great. Can I just add? Thank you. That's very helpful. Can I just suggest, Frank, that perhaps you might want to focus on the second question, because I'm not sure that the politics of Oxford and Cambridge is really pertinent to this evening.
Yes, I'm from Edinburgh. Thank you. I mean, I think you're right. The United States has always been disunited at some level. And that's why we have a federal system. And the federal system is meant to adjudicate the differences in interest between the states and balance those. It works better at some times than others. I think we're at a period now which is quite interesting, because for many, many years, it was so-called red states that were resisting the federal government because they saw it as interfering with their interests and values. And now, as you indicated, blue states like California, Oregon, when it comes to climate change, are bucking the federal government. As far as the judiciary goes, we've got to see how this plays out. I think that the current moment is a real test, constitutional test for the judiciary. Supreme Court's about to release a bunch of new decisions, as it always does at this time of year, and it will be interesting to see what they have to say. But the Supreme Court has not always had 9 members. It's fluctuated in size over the years. I think the United States is in the midst of what may be a constitutional crisis. Yeah. And I think what will follow this, and something will follow this, will likely be, well, actually, I'm terrible at making predictions, but will likely be a period of reform and correction against some of the excesses of this moment, including possibly reform of the judiciary. We saw that in the mid-1970s after Watergate, and I think we may see a correction like that after President Trump is gone. But
yeah, thank you. I think other people probably would like to ask questions.
There was one in the back there, Adrian. That guy had his hand up first, I think. Sorry, I didn't mean to.
It's a little bit in the theme which we sort of moved it into, in terms of just your perception of the strength of institutions within the US government framework and the checks and balances, which, historically we've always been sort of told, yes, the US system works because, nobody can get the upper hand because there's always, like the president is sort of prescribed somehow, and that seems to have changed a lot in recent years, and I guess you tipped a nod to it just a second ago. But just thinking about, why is it sort of going adrift, in your opinion?
Okay, those are 2 very easy questions. Thanks a lot. Why is it going adrift? I think there are lots and lots of reasons for that. Some of which are, frankly, global developments. I think the spread of populism and right-wing populism is not unique to the United States. I think it's got a particular variant in the United States. So I think the features that produce that, globalization, Hillary Clinton back in 2016 famously or infamously talked about Trump supporters. She divided them into 2 baskets, and one was the basket of deplorables, and that's what was remembered. Right? And it was terrible politics because that was used against her. They still use it. There was a second basket. She said most of the bigger basket are people who were left behind by globalization and neoliberal policies. And we, that is, those who have benefited from those, have failed them. And that's why they're attracted to President Trump. She said the other basket are the racists and gun nuts and religious fanatics. We're never going to get them. We don't want them. People only remember the deplorables. It was a pretty sound analysis in terms of your second part of your question about how we got here. In terms of checks and balances, as I said at the end, Americans had great faith in their Constitution, and with some justification. That Constitution is very old. Among the liberal democracies, it's probably the oldest Constitution. And it's not necessarily fit for purpose anymore. And even suggesting that, thank God I have a UK passport now, that's all I can say, because it's assumed a kind of place as sacred writ, like you can't change it. It's amendable for a reason. The people who framed it didn't think it was perfect and thought we should change it. Jefferson famously said about constitutions, we would no more expect a man to wear the coat he wore when he was a boy as us to be governed by our barbarous ancestors. And he meant him. Like, you need to change with the times. So I think Americans need to realize this. Adrian and I were talking about this earlier. I think the unbroken past that Americans imagine, going back to 1776, my own period, is actually an obstacle to change. If we were French, we'd be on our 4th or 5th republic now in the United States. And we'd accept that change is what happens. But because we have this imagined unbroken history, and it's not true. Civil War is a pretty major break, as you know. But there's a kind of belief that there's this unbroken constitutional line, and I think that's an obstacle to change. So I think that's one of the problems with checks and balances. That guy had a question, Adrian, the gentleman right there.
Thank you.
Yep. Sorry, I spotted him. I don't need to take your...
You've very interestingly been talking about what American people think and what British people think. You've kept off, is that on purpose or not, what goes on behind the scenes? I'm, for instance, not convinced that a huge number of people in this room know that Roosevelt was determined we would not be able to keep colonies, and we have been paying the Americans since, I believe, it was 2003 and 2004. And I think there's an awful lot of things go on. Ascension Island actually belongs to us in the Atlantic, but I can tell you, having flown there, we had to get special permission from the Americans to fly there. They have banned it being used as an alternate, for instance, for this new airport on St. Helena. An awful lot seems to go on behind the scenes, which a lot of people don't mention. Isn't this quite important?
Yes. Yes, it is. And it's not what I chose to emphasize tonight because I wanted to develop a different argument. But yeah, what goes on behind the scenes is hugely important. But again, it's a little bit like the Falklands question. There's what goes on for public consumption in both countries because they're both democracies, and then there's what goes on behind the scenes. One of the problems, or challenges for historians, not problems, is we often don't learn these things until many, many years after because documents are classified and so on, and we're relying on incomplete records. But yeah, I completely agree with you that those things are important. They are important, of course they are. And one of the underlying tensions between the governments is the changing power dynamic between them over the course of the last 100+ years. And that has been tough for Britain to accept. And I think American governments haven't always been sensitive to that and probably should have been. But yeah, I think it's very important. Thank you.
Can I ask a question?
No.
Well, cultural convergence and the argument that Britain and the United States have never been closer. If you're critiquing that, you'd say that's a very white perspective, in that possibly black popular culture is an even better example of the way in which, through rap and hip-hop and associated, in inverted commas, ghetto culture, has had a huge and profound influence on British youth, and not just black British youth, across the last, 30 years now?
Yes. Okay. You're asking me questions that I'm agreeing with.
Okay,
but for example, I mean, and again, I want to be a little careful because this is not an area of expertise for me. There's been a recently, if I can use the Scottish word, do I have your permission to use the Scottish word? There's been one of my favorite Scottish words. There's been a recent stramash because the British actor David Oluwayo has criticized black Southern culture in the United States. And that has, on social media, and I've only been privy to some of this because I'm not a huge figure in black social media, but there's been a huge kind of row about this and a discussion about just that issue, Adrian, recently, which is a very interesting event.
Right, Mike.
Yeah. Two things. First, briefly, that black culture thing has been going on a long time.
Yeah.
Certainly since blackface minstrelsy in the late 19th century. And then it's important to remember one of the first European jazz bands was British.
Sorry, yep.
Oh yeah, sorry. That was just a comment on jazz and all that. But what I wanted to ask you, you mentioned that this thing about institutions being shaky and the balance of power, and this kind of looking back and Jefferson's lovely comment about not wearing the coat of a boy, you know, and is this interpretive, Scalia's interpretation of originalism, is that a form of trying to preserve what he called a dead document?
What Scalia called it,
a dead document.
Yeah, I mean, originalism is a kind of judicial theory that the Supreme Court, when it interprets the law, needs to go back and determine the original meaning. It's a little bit like biblical fundamentalism. In fact, it's a lot like biblical fundamentalism. Like, we have to understand the document as it was originally intended. My own view is that what you get when this happens is you get people who aren't historians pretending to be historians. They're lawyers. And lawyers have a very different approach. Sorry, I love you, all the lawyers in the room. But lawyers have a different approach to the past than historians do. So I have a student right now, a PhD student, who's in California. He's doing a distance learning PhD. He's a lawyer, and he's looking at the origins of the treason clause. And what I have to keep saying to him is, Francis, your job is not to find evidence in support of your argument. Because that's what lawyers do. You have to make the best possible argument. I said, your job is to read the evidence and figure out what they were saying, and then interpret that. And he's very smart, and he's going to get it eventually, but it's a real struggle. And I think with originalism, what we get is the patina of a historical understanding, the assumption that we can understand what they really meant. But again, it's amendable for a reason. They knew it should be changed. They didn't think it should be unchangeable and unchanged. It's hard to amend because they were worried about democratic excess and mob rule and things like that. So, they didn't want people to amend the Constitution for kind of whimsical reasons, which is why it's difficult and perhaps impossible in the current political situation to amend, but it's amendable for a reason.
Okay. Question over there.
Yeah, the cost of running for President of the United States is huge. I'm concerned that is there a reservoir of good men and women coming forward that will actually address the issues in America and the world without actually necessarily having the finance backing to do that?
One of the most important Supreme Court decisions of this era was the one on campaign finance reform that basically removed all the brakes. And it's prohibitively expensive. Fortunately, I have a Bitcoin if you want to invest in it so I can run. And the potential for corruption is huge, and we've seen that. And I hope that if and when there's a correction, that campaign finance reform will have to be part of it. Now, it will never be capped necessarily. I mean, that's just not the way of American politics. But the fact that President Trump ran for president and did not share his tax returns. Now, there's no legal requirement to do so. This is one of these things that was a custom. Presidential candidates always shared their tax returns in advance of running for president. Trump doesn't want us to see his tax returns, obviously, and he fought in the courts to prevent that. There's going to have to be campaign finance reform, I think. Could we hear from a woman?
Right. No. Two questions. There's a gentleman back there, wasn't there? Yeah. And then we might be able to squeeze you in, Maggie. Okay. Oh, right.
Oh, it's like an academic conference.
Do you think social media is going to be a help or a hindrance to the development of the cultural special relationship?
I think it's one of the things that has facilitated the coming together of the two cultures. So I think it's been a big part of that convergence, and it's been a big part of the emergence of a global culture, and also it's given voice. So let me make the positive case. It's also highlighted cultures that are not just British and American, which has been a good thing. On the other hand, and that hand is very large, the baneful effects of social media on our culture, I'm going to sound really grumpy now, but on our culture, on our brains, and on our politics, and again, this is not a uniquely American problem, is pretty profound. But the other thing that strikes me on social media, and this annoys British Frank as opposed to American Frank, I don't know why every even relatively small American controversy or kerfuffle has to blow up on British social media. And it always does, or often does, I shouldn't say always. So I think social media has been responsible for some good developments, but remember it was going to bring us all together and democratize knowledge and all that? Those were the days.
Just a quick comment of perhaps solidarity. When you mentioned Americans were feeling pitied, I think I felt solidarity in 2016 when the UK came out of the EU. We had to apologise. If you hadn't voted to leave the EU, when you went abroad, you had to apologise for it. And the Americans I've met in the last few years, they make an apology. So there is solidarity between us.
If you think I'm going to touch that, let's talk about Trump. That's something less controversial. But thank you. Yeah, I think
Just
that's right.
have one last question for this gentleman here.
On convergence, it seems to me that Trump is so controversial that he's dividing America into his supporters and his opponents. The opponents who are being driven away from his thinking may be inclined to move towards England because it offers something that's not like Trump. Do you think this is the case? And above all, if you do, what will be the long-term effect of that when Trump is gone?
Thank you. That's a really interesting question. I mean, one of the problems with my presentation is the assumption that underlies it that there's some sort of homogenous, either British or American culture. And I understand there's a huge amount of diversity in both countries. And I think that's reflected in both your question, but also in Trump's support. So Trump's support, now, I'm going to qualify this slightly, and here's a factoid for you that might shock you. More people, in 2020, more people voted for Trump in California than Texas. So when we talk about red and blue, we have to be a little bit careful. Having said that, there is a difference between metropolitan America, cities, exurbs and suburbs, and rural America. And there's a big culture war going on in the United States and a culture sorting that's been going on forever along those lines. And I think, and one sees this all the time, I think if you go to the East Coast or the West Coast, it's frankly not all that different from Western Europe in cultural terms. So I think there is an affinity there, but you're correct, I think underlying your question, I think a lot of Trump supporters who, in many cases, don't travel, don't know much about Britain, you know, they probably aren't watching Ted Lasso, more's the pity, aren't necessarily part of this convergence. And I think you're right in how we bridge those gaps in the same way that some of the votes we've seen in the UK in recent years also reflect that there's a bit of cultural friction here as well. And in emphasizing convergence and trying to end on a happy note and saying, we got more in common, it's okay. If I were to critique myself, and I think you've very politely offered a critique, I think it lacked that nuance. If you'd like to stay for another 4 hours, I could unpack that nuance if you like.
I think we'll pass on that. In a moment, I'm going to ask you to express your appreciation for Frank's talk. But before that, I think we ought to have a little presentation. So Frank's from Boston. And I suppose if I said to you, what's the first thing you think about in Boston? You might say the Tea Party. Frank is also unusual insofar as he doesn't drink coffee. No? He's the only American I've ever met who doesn't drink coffee.
I am the world's most interesting man.
Yeah. But he does drink tea. So Boston, Tea Party. So, and I thought, well, you know, is there any company in the New Forest that produces tea? Obviously, I'm not assuming that there are plantations on the slopes of Barton-on-Sea or whatever, but you know, I thought there must be. Thank you, Truffles, because there is. There is a New Forest company which has started packaging tea. So it's incumbent upon me, on behalf of all of you, to express our appreciation and give Frank his New Forest tea.
Thank you, Adrian. Thank you. You're all very kind. Let me leave you with one more anecdote. Testimony to the special relationship. My son is in the United States right now with the Tartan Army, my Scottish son. He was in Little Italy the other day in New York wearing a kilt, and they gave him 2 free slices of pizza just for being Scottish.
Wow. Well, it's been a wonderful talk, and clearly you've demonstrated your appreciation. So looking ahead to next month, we gather on 17th of July, and there will be, this is one of the occasions when we have a talk which ties in with the exhibition at the museum and the art gallery. Excuse me. And this is the David McKee sketchbook, The Origins of Mr. Ben and Elmer, and the speaker is Simon Guerrier. I look forward to seeing you all on that occasion. Thank you very much.